A single miscalculation, an error of 800%, doomed an entire empire before the first shot was even fired. It wasn't a fleet, a battle, or a brilliant general that decided the fate of the Pacific. It was a simple number ignored out of pride. How could an entire nation walk straight into its own downfall by trusting a mathematical fantasy? And more importantly, what does this mistake reveal about how leaders, companies, and ordinary people still make decisions today? Because once you understand this error, you'll realize the story isn't about Japan, it's about all of us. The contrast was brutal. While Japanese strategists estimated that the United States would only be able to mobilize around 300,000 men, the real American capacity reached 2.3 million. It was an error, bordering on 800%, yet no one dared to question it. Studies indicate that this kind of strategic failure is born long before the first combat. And here, it wasn't ignorance. It was the old illusion that confidence alone is enough to win a war that hasn't even begun. What is curious is that the internal reports were not wrong in their raw data, but in how that data was interpreted. Analysts believed the American industry would take years to react, ignoring obvious signs of accelerated growth. Researchers point out that this failure wasn't technical, it was emotional. Collective arrogance clouded any intelligence analysis, turning neutral numbers into comforting illusions. And when an empire confuses desire with reality, the future begins to crack. This monstrous discrepancy emerged even before Pearl Harbor, when there was still time to correct the course. But no one wanted to listen, because admitting the mistake meant rethinking the entire national strategy. The math was screaming, but the culture was silencing it. This combination led to decisions that looked heroic, but were, in practice, just the beginning of a one-way road. And the story of a perfect spy explains why it all got even worse. He was known as someone invisible, polite enough to avoid suspicion, curious enough to cross borders without being noticed. Inin Teo Yoshiawa became almost a quiet legend, a Japanese 007 who made his missions look like simple sightseeing trips. He flew from place to place, took photos, studied routes, observed ships, always with that air of an ordinary traveler. But behind that discreet smile, there was meticulous work that many would only understand too late, revealing how cognitive bias can be more dangerous than any armed enemy. The information he gathered was so precise that, in theory, it should have saved Japan from fatal mistakes. He brought detailed maps, exact counts, entire military routines from the United States. But perfect data, when it lands in the wrong hands, becomes useless. Those responsible for analysis treated this information as curiosities, not warnings. A mix of rigid hierarchy and intellectual disdain created an environment where truth was seen as insolence, feeding a cycle of decision-making increasingly disconnected from reality. Cultural prejudice made everything worse. In Japan at that time, intelligence analysts were seen as inferior to career military officers. And when an institution sees its own specialists as obstacles, collapse stops being a risk and becomes destiny. Yoshiawa handed everything over on a silver platter, but no one wanted to chew it. This institutional blindness would prove decisive when the supposed quick victory collided with the real math of the battlefield, and the first shock came painfully. The strategy looked elegant on paper: strike fast, hit hard, force the United States to retreat, and negotiate peace before they could react. It was a confident, almost romantic vision of what to expect from modern war. But studies indicate that any plan based on fragile assumptions usually collapses on first contact with reality. And Japan would soon discover this when its initial calculation collided with a fatal math error. No one had the courage to reassess. The first fracture appeared in the Coral Sea. The Japanese expected around 4,000 American casualties, but found almost double, something completely outside the forecast. American behavior contradicted every estimate. And the most symbolic part of all this was the Yorktown. The aircraft carrier that should have been at the bottom of the sea, yet simply refused to die. Researchers suggest that this was the moment Japan should have recognized the scale of American industrial mobilization, but confirmation bias spoke louder. The internal reaction was denial, instead of reconsidering their own calculations. Japanese leaders concluded that the Americans were simply inefficient, incapable of understanding their own chaos. This type of distorted interpretation contaminated entire reports and postponed urgent changes. Reality was knocking at the door, and no one wanted to open it. And it was precisely this denial that turned Pearl Harbor into a prelude, because the real nightmare was still waiting at Guadalcanal. In August 1942, everything theoretical became real. The arrival of 16,000 Marines, protected by more than 30,000 sailors, dismantled the Japanese illusion that the United States was weakened. Studies indicate that the logistical shock was immediate. That wasn't just a landing, it was a brutal demonstration of military reach. And when evidence like that appears right in front of you, any underestimated industrial capacity starts charging a price in lives. Japan simply couldn't keep up. Every attempt at reinforcement was interrupted by American submarines, turning supply lines into a daily torment. It was like trying to put out a fire with a cup of water. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who studied at Harvard and understood the enemy more clearly, knew the American pace would only accelerate. But his warnings were dismissed as pessimism, overshadowed once again by rigid hierarchies and unshakable beliefs, something typical of institutionalized cognitive bias. Reports from the time show growing frustration. Every Japanese convoy felt like an announced sacrifice. And when troops have to fight hungry without ammunition or support, defeat stops being a risk and becomes routine. Guadalcanal exposed a truth too harsh to ignore. The war would not be short, clean, or controllable. And precisely for that reason, Japanese command decided to reevaluate everything in a hurry, which led to the most dangerous and uncomfortable report of the entire war. Pressure in Tokyo was rising. After months of accumulated losses, military leaders demanded a full reassessment of the war in the Pacific. Researchers describe this period as a marathon of sleepless nights, analyzing everything: production, logistics, losses, and maritime routes. The result was frightening. Internal projections showed that the United States had already reached 1.8 million available men and would quickly climb to 2.4 million. A devastating blow for any honest intelligence analysis. The report made it clear that continuing to advance was unsustainable. It pointed to a statistically inevitable defeat if Japan insisted on its offensive strategy. But the numerical shock did not stop there. The analysts acknowledged that American mobilization was only beginning, something scholars call the awakening industrial monster. It was too much information for a government still trying to keep the narrative of a quick victory alive. The final decision was as symbolic as it was tragic. The report was classified as ultra-secret, with the official justification of protecting the warrior spirit from the facts. In other words, they hid the only truth capable of saving the country. That refusal to deal with bad data echoes today in companies, governments, and leaders who prefer empty motivation over concrete reality. And the price of that choice would become unavoidable when Japan bet everything on the battle that came next, a battle where the imbalance would be exposed without mercy. The name already said everything: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For many American pilots, the battle felt like target practice, given the technological and operational gap between both sides. Japan gathered its last 9 aircraft carriers, practically everything that remained of its offensive naval force. But when a nation fights a power with immense logistical reach, any delayed decision-making becomes a pre-written sentence. And there, the math left no room for miracles. On the other side, the United States arrived with 15 carriers and more than 100 escort ships. Studies indicate that this kind of disparity doesn't happen by accident, but through industrial advantages accumulated over years. The result was brutal. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, dozens of veteran pilots vanished, and, in contrast, only 29 American aircraft were lost. Researchers affirm that this was the moment the war stopped being a contest and became an inevitability, driven by America's industrial capacity. For Japan, the hardest part was realizing that the United States could restore aircraft and ships in a matter of days, while they needed months, when they managed it all. The balance had tipped for good. The courage of Japanese pilots was real, but that means little when the enemy's machine rebuilds faster than you destroy. And it was this asymmetry that pushed the empire toward its final bitter lesson. A lesson that explains why so many modern organizations repeat the same mistakes without noticing. Looking at the entire Pacific campaign, it becomes clear that Pearl Harbor did not decide Japan's fate. The defeat began much earlier, in the underestimated spreadsheet of 1941, where optimistic forecasts were confused with reality. Researchers explain that great strategic collapses almost always begin this way, not from an enemy strike, but from blind self-confidence. And this pattern crosses decades, bringing down empires and companies alike. The mix of rigid culture, intellectual arrogance, and disdain for critical analysis creates environments where no one wants to be the bearer of bad news. Major brands like Kodak, Nokia, and Blockbuster lived this firsthand, each trapped in its own myth, unable to see market movement. This kind of cognitive bias corrodes decisions silently until the organization wakes up too late. When that happens, strength and tradition stop being an advantage and become a burden. Meanwhile, the United States demonstrated the opposite: the ability to adapt constant data review, and an industrial mobilization that grew like a monster awakened. It wasn't luck, it was method. It was vision, it was strategic discipline. And that cultural difference explains why Japan, despite its military talent, could never keep up. But this story becomes even clearer when we understand the three biases that drove the country directly into collapse, and that continue to bring down leaders today. The first fatal mistake was projection bias. Japanese leaders assumed that the United States would think and react like they did, fast, cautious, and guided by honor. But studies indicate that analyzing the enemy through your own mirror is a classic source of strategic failure. It was this assumption that made Tokyo believe the Americans would quit after the first blow, completely ignoring the emotional and industrial depth of the adversary. And when a strategy is born from mistaken expectations, it is already fractured. The second poison was confirmation bias, that silent impulse to search only for what reinforces the desired narrative. After Coral Sea and Midway, every sign pointed to something being wrong. Even so, critical reports were distorted, softened, or ignored. According to specialists in intelligence analysis, this kind of behavior is common in companies and governments that fear appearing weak. Leaders cling to illusion, believing optimism can defeat math, a choice that always extracts its price. The third bias is as common today as it was in 1942, survivorship bias. Only the success stories are told, failures disappear. Reports showing real losses were shelved to protect national spirit, when mistakes are invisible. They cannot be corrected. This pattern appears in startups, investments, and personal careers. Focusing only on wins creates a false perception of the world. And it is precisely this distortion that opens the door to wonder what would have happened if Tokyo had listened to its own numbers. Imagine for a moment that in 1942, Tokyo had recognized the real scale of American mobilization. Researchers suggest that a strategic withdrawal at that point was still plausible before the wear became irreversible. If Japan had taken the warnings from the Imperial Japanese Navy seriously, it could have renegotiated defensive positions and reduced significant losses. A hypothetical scenario, but one that reveals how decision-making changes the fate of entire nations. Accepting the numbers would have forced the country to rethink everything: logistics, territorial ambitions, and even the foundations of its Pacific strategy. The comparison with Nazi Germany is inevitable. Both ignored the colossal difference in industrial capacity when challenging much larger powers. And in this alternate universe, the mistake would not have evolved into a fatal math error, but into a life-saving change of course. This kind of strategic imagination helps modern leaders see that retreating is sometimes the only rational path. But there was an almost insurmountable obstacle: the cultural spirit of Bushido and the inability to admit limits. The so-called sunk cost trap weighed on every choice, pushing the country deeper into the conflict. Even so, this counterfactual exercise reveals something powerful. Courage is not always moving forward. It is knowing when to stop before everything collapses. And this reflection opens the door to the final question, the one that ties the entire journey together. What does this story teach about our own decisions today? The greatest lesson in this story is simple. No strategy survives when leaders refuse to see numerical reality. Japan didn't lose for lack of courage, but for ignoring facts that were clear from the beginning. And this strategic blindness continues to destroy organizations even today. If numbers don't guide our decisions, we inevitably pay the price. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning about strategy, historical analysis, and intelligent decision-making.